you very much. I want to thank you guys for inviting me. I was lucky enough to be part of the first SAPECS meeting, and so I'm happy to be at the third. I'm from the Netherlands, so I may have a Dutch accent, despite the fact that Belinda always says I'm honorary South African, although given the connotations in the past of the term honorary, I'm not sure that's a compliment. But I'm really happy to be here. I adapted my PowerPoint presentation a bit on the basis of the talk from yesterday. And Ryan, you can see that your power times politics, because that's exactly what I want to talk about. This morning I also heard all kinds of things, and I thought, okay, I said, oh, I should put this in, I should put that in. So I hope I'm going to be not too incoherent. But there's a number of issues I would like to draw your attention to. Well, starting with the obvious, we keep repeating that to ourselves, and it's true. You know, we are living in an interconnected global society with all kinds of new cross-scale interactions connecting people and places, society and nature. Interactions in social-ecological systems have always been complex, but have become even more so. Multiple subsystems nested across scales, complex feedback loops with slow drivers, fast drivers, etc. And so we all repeat, and also in the scientific committee of the International PACS program, what we really need is adaptive approaches to management and governance in the face of high levels of uncertainty and change. And that requires the collaboration of diverse stakeholders operating at different ecological and social scales in multi-level institutions. And it requires the management of trade-offs and synergies. This is all very true, but there's a number of complicating factors, I'm afraid, that we really, I argue, really need to deal with if we want to study this. First of all, we heard Gary explain the complex linkages between ecosystem degradation and human well-being. And human well-being is always added as a very important objective when we study social-ecological systems. But then, of course, ecosystem services and human well-being are both objectively and subjectively defined. So what we consider, what some people consider an ecosystem service may not be that relevant for other people. And I also like the term of disservices that came up. I think it was in Patrick's talk. That was, I thought that was very interesting too. And we heard Kate explain that we really need to look at, when we talk about ecosystem services and human well-being, we really need to look at the way ecosystem services are valued, by whom they are valued, access people have or lack, the differences in needs, and the distribution of benefits from ecosystems across different groups in society. What I've also noticed is that there's a lot of ambiguity in the way we deal with poverty. We talk about poverty. Because on the one hand, we often say that poverty is a cause of environmental degradation, and that people are trapped in the state of poverty, and so they degrade. Well, first of all, the ecological footprint of a lot of poor people is a lot smaller than that of affluent people. But also there's, so we talk about poverty and degradation, so we need to do something about poverty, but we also don't want people to develop too much, because we don't want them to consume at the same levels that we do. So we really need to rethink that, and it's got everything to do with distribution and hence with politics. The interactions between local to global drivers of social-ecological system change are also rendering these studies very complex. Because sometimes people at local levels experience huge pressures to do things in a certain way without being able to influence those drivers. Sometimes also local drivers have an impact on higher scales. But we really have to look at especially also at the economic drivers. And there's a lot, I will get back to that later. There's a lot of influence from global levels on local resource users and producers. We also have to deal with, and it's related to that, with legal plurality and competing claims on ecosystem services. And I think that conservation claims are an important example of that. It's sort of claimed as global common goods, but then lots of local people depend on the resources in those, but their powers, their decision making may be restricted because of these global claims. So there's lots of competing claims and lots of conflicts about certain resources. Brian Walker already mentioned it. It's very difficult to model governance because there's so many factors influencing it. And what we've seen is an increasing influence of the private sector and civil society. And you mentioned that sometimes it's good to sort of be able to bypass government, and that for a long time was the idea that if you work directly with civil society, you have access to local groups, and private sector engagement is important because private sector is a huge resource user, polluter, so we need to be communicating with them. But there's also, we need to be aware of the downsides of that, of the way in which private sector engagement may also compromise some of our objectives, and also issues around accountability. How accountable are these partners to the rest of the population? How much influence do we have over them? Probably the democratic control. So in short, we are dealing with, and it's unavoidable, I'm afraid, with power relations, diverging interests, and inequality. Studying governance at multi-level scales is complicated. We will keep repeating that it's important, and it is, but it's also difficult to do. And it already starts with, when you look at the global conventions, you see a lot of contradictions between those. You know, on the one hand, we have all those biodiversity targets, but at the same time, we also have the WTO agreements that contradict some of these aims. And we really need to look at that. These agreements and sort of what we are witnessing is sort of a global spread of the neoliberal economic model. And that model is based on the market. It's based also on growth. And especially the growth components may be something that we need to reconsider. But these have an effect on national development priorities and possibilities, and also on local level governance and ecosystem services. And I think Shiona's talk this morning also showed that very much. There's some cross-scale connections. There's some actors that participate in multiple agreements and can try and link these. But there's also gaps, and there's also certain groups in society that are not able to influence these policies that are designed at higher levels. So we need to look at the communities and try and lever them, but we also need to look at the gaps. There's huge variations. If we look at governance structures, from the global to the local level, there's huge variations in the degree of transparency and representativity, legitimacy, but also discretionary powers that people have in these various institutions. And I think if we look at community-based natural resource management projects, we talk about community-based, about participation, but often these projects only serve for people to be informed about what's happening to the resources in their area, and not really people don't really have a say into how these resources are managed. So we really need to look at that, and we really need to look also at how governments, for instance in relation to decentralization processes, how governments allow certain government institutions to actually have discretionary powers and others not. We also are, again, we have to come back to this, the legal plurality. I think in South Africa it's a huge issue where you have, on the one hand, locally elected, some more, some less democratic local government institutions, and you have traditional authorities that also have been granted some powers over resources. And of course, the path dependency, and that came up also in Shiona's talk, I think, where you have to deal with, even if you want, we're always talking about, we need to develop governance structures that are positive, that result in positive change, but we're also dealing with all these institutional legacies. Also institutional memory. Sometimes institutional memory is wiped out if you have a transformation and you get new people in, and then sometimes they tend to make the same mistakes because the institutional memory is gone. Also institutional entrepreneurships, people who use institutions to try and organize certain changes. But then there's differences in the ability, capacity, and the power people have to do that. So we really need to look at that. And we need to look at the vested interests. And people that, and it came up in Brian's talk too, that sometimes authorities are ensuring that there's no change because it's not in the interest of certain parties involved. So I'm afraid it means that we have to engage with the politics and power relations. Because it's crucial to look at these questions. You know, who defines what an ecosystem service is? Who claims the service? Who governs the service and how do they govern it? And who's involved in that? Who benefits from them? And this kind of links to the debate that's been going on for some time about, you know, in relation to IPBES and all those big global environmental policies, Future Earth 2. You know, this question about what is our role as scientists. And we've had some interesting examples of how, you know, some of the tasks are on us. We have to be able to discuss what we find in a way that is understandable, legible, for people who are busy and don't have time. But that's not the whole story. It's also about, when we talk about ecosystem services, when we talk about the environment, it is about the distribution of access to resources, and that is political. And yet there's always this pressure on us to be policy relevant, but not prescriptive, not tell policymakers what to do. And of course there is, I mean, we also need to be accountable. Some of the choices that we make may also not be acceptable to certain groups in society. But I think at least we have to be open about the choices that we make, about our basic assumptions when we do this kind of research. Because as, for instance, Peter Bridgewater and a group of other colleagues have said, well, if you're not prescriptive, if you don't engage with the politics, you allow politicians to take your results and run with them and interpret them in line with their political projects, and also sort of suppress information that is not consistent with that. And I really like Aaron's presentation this morning also, where she showed how, you know, public opinion and the way people talk about disasters influences how they are dealt with. And I think we really need to be careful that we don't become, as researchers, that we serve as an anti-politics machine. That was a phrase that was coined by James Ferguson on development studies, saying that development studies that focus on the technical aspects and say, okay, if you get this condition right and that condition right, with very much the technical issues, and then you can address poverty, then you can alleviate poverty, but without actually addressing the what Kate has also called our attention to, the structural conditions and the structural causes of poverty. Do you focus on the technical issues or the ecological processes underlying it without talking about the structural causes, and you're actually hiding what goes on, you're hiding the causes of these unequal distributions. And I think we really need to be clear about our assumptions. If we talk about poverty, we have to make sure that people know from which point of view we look at poverty, but we also have to really focus on the distribution of benefits, risks, and costs within and across scales, because local level communities are also quite heterogeneous. Well, it's been said several times. For these reasons, Southern Africa, of course, is a very good place to study these things, because you have the colonial and apartheid legacies in the distribution of benefits, risks, and costs. You have the institutional legacies. You also have a government that, on the one hand, tries to address these the consequences of these legacies, but at the same time has also adopted this neoliberal economic model, which sometimes clashes with these attempts to redress inequalities. And I think that pertains especially to the increased marginalization of people in the rural areas of South Africa. We also have, of course, South Africa and its relations to its neighbors, where we also sometimes see power differences. This is a map of the Great Limpopo Transfrontier Conservation Area, where we have been awarded land claim on the park and are sharing benefits. On the Mozambican side, 7,000 people are being kicked out to turn that area into a second Kruger, or an extension of Kruger. There's some people here who know a lot more about that. We've discussed this before. So there's difference, but it also has to do with our relations between the region. So it's a very interesting area. I only have a few minutes left, so I won't do everything. But what's also interesting is the organization of livelihoods strategies across spatial scales. So the linkages between the rural and the urban, that is very interesting here in South Africa to study. Very important, and that can also generate lessons for the north. Poverty reduction, but we also need to talk about what are the consequences of sustaining wealth. How much does that cost us? And when we talk about planetary boundaries and we say we need to consume less, well, we need to consume less. We really need to talk about that. Different social cultural constructions of nature, I think that came also up in the talk by Michelle and Susie. People have different ways of looking at nature, defining nature, but then not all perspectives are equally valued. So who defines what nature is and how it should be conserved? And I think the project that Utama presented is very interesting in that sense too, because it is thinking about different conservation strategies, different access for people living around these areas. We've been talking a lot these days about using different kinds of knowledges to get more insight into the management of natural ecosystem services. But here again, power issues are at play because not all knowledge is equally valued, and we are working on ways to actually use, well, sort of not use knowledge as to be utilitarian, but really take that into account in ways that do justice to these different kinds of knowledges. A very quick example, and I really will go very, very quickly through that, is a project that's been coordinated with my colleague Shirley Brooks, who's now at the University of Western Cape, looking at the consequences of a lot of farms in the Eastern Cape and KwaZulu-Natal converting from conventional farming to game farming. And what we see is some of the aspects that came out as wilderness is becoming a commodity. Who benefits from it? It's led to a lot of evictions of farm workers and former tenants from farms. It's part of the use, not the cause, but it's related to huge concentration of land. So in South Africa there's fewer groups and individuals owning more of the land. Foreign and domestic elites investing in that, and they're very hard to get at when we do research on these issues. Those groups, those elites are very difficult to access. We see a disconnection between labor issues and land rights, and this idea that jobs are benefits, but we have to think about that too. Taking a job for a very low wage, is that really a benefit? Does it compensate for you losing your cattle? Impacts on land reforms, etc. It's a very interesting project that shows all these power relations and politics. Thank you very much.